morning, historians. So we have another lesson on our early presidents and some of the important things that they did early on. Yesterday we talked about George Washington and how he was beloved and some of the precedents or the examples that he set that presidents still follow today, like the presidential cabinet. We talked about John Adams and how he was kind of an unpopular president, but he did the right thing because he chose not to go to war, which is the right thing for the country, but it was the unpopular decision, and he did not get re-elected. So we were developing a nation with those early presidents, but now we're going to talk a little bit about how some of these early presidents expanded or made the nation bigger. So Adams, like I said, he was unpopular enough to not get elected again, but he did run for president. Adams was a man, like I said, that made the right decision even though it wasn't a popular one. And that means he was a man of integrity. He stuck to his beliefs. But now it was time for people to select another president. The Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans had grown bigger and stronger in parties, and they caused the election between Adams and Jefferson to be filled with a lot of name calling and a lot of fighting. It was kind of not as peaceful as the first two elections were. So let's talk about, before we get too deep in, what your objective is today and your success criteria. So you have two objectives again today, and the first one is I can answer questions about early presidents of the United States. That's the same objective you had yesterday. This one's just a little bit different. I can answer questions about some of the decisions that grew the size of the nation. So we've got some interesting things that happened that kind of made, because we started with only 13 colonies. Well, somehow we became the 50 states, right? It slowly happened, but there's a decision that happened that really made a big advance in this. Your success criteria, how you know you're going to be successful, is if you can answer those questions correctly on an exit ticket. And it's the same kind of exit ticket that you had yesterday. Make sure that you are, after you watch this video, you go back to your Google Classroom into your classwork and select on this other assignment that is the exit ticket to complete this. Okay. So our agenda for today is we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about James Madison, and then, as what was on the screen already, we're going to talk a bit about the War of 1812. So, Thomas Jefferson, let's talk about who he was, something that he did, a lucky bargain. He was a lucky bargain, meaning that he got a deal, and then trying to stay out of war again. So these are some big things that happened while he was a president. So Thomas Jefferson. He was really well known. One, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? But he was also a very well known architect, lawyer, scholar, inventor, author, farmer, and politician. He was a lot of things. He wore a lot of hats. And he was good at everything, it seems like. And now he was also the president of the United States because he beat John Adams in the election. And he was the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. So that's the party that kind of liked the smaller government. They were the big supporters of the farmers and liked smaller cities, didn't want big cities. I wanted to add this in here because it's important because of our school, Monticello. So Jefferson was from Virginia, and he had a plantation there. He was a plantation owner, and he had designed and supervised the construction of his home. And this picture right here is the picture of what his home looks like. Still today, it's still standing today. It had it built on top of a mountaintop, so he named his home Monticello. Back in that time, when you had a big plantation, a lot of times you named it. George Washington's home was named Mount Vernon, and Thomas Jefferson's home's name was Monticello, and that's where we've taken our school name, Monticello. He invented many gadgets for Monticello, lots of things inside his home that are still there for today, and people can actually go to his home and visit it and look at some of the things that he had invented while he lived there. Thomas Jefferson had a lot of strong beliefs. First of all, the pursuit of happiness. This is something that he put in the Declaration of Independence. Pursuit of happiness means that you're searching and you're going towards what's making you happy and what you believe in. He believed that this was only possible when the rights and freedoms of ordinary people were protected. Remember, a lot of other people felt like it was only educated and well-to-do people that could run the country, but Thomas Jefferson believed that ordinary people could. Anybody, the farmer, the poor person, the person that, you know, he just believed anybody could run, have a say in running their government. That means, and what that meant is that these people needed to govern themselves. He didn't believe that the rights and liberties of people could be protected if they did not have a say in that. But he did have one thing about that, though. He believed in education. He was a huge proponent of educated people. A lot of people back then couldn't read, and they didn't go to school. And he thought that education was the only way for people to know how to govern themselves. So he thought the only way that, yeah, like I said, the only way that people could pursue happiness and govern themselves and have a strong government was if they were educated. And so he wanted free education for everyone. He wanted the state of Virginia, where he was a delegate at first, to develop a program where everybody could go to school for free. Sadly, he wasn't really able to convince the state of Virginia to do this at that time, and it was still just wealthy white boys that could go to school. Why is my thing not moving? There we go. So there was also a big thing in the South at the time called slavery. We've talked a little bit about slavery. And he believed slavery was evil. He didn't think it was the right thing to do. And he even tried to pass an ordinance that made slavery illegal in all of the western states, the new states that were being added. However, this didn't pass. It didn't pass by only one vote in Congress. There was one person that was still for slavery, and so slavery still stayed legal in all those states. But he did persuade Congress to end the slave trade to America. So what that means is that Americans could no longer bring enslaved people over from Africa, but the people that were enslaved in the United States, they could it was still legal to have them as enslaved workers, and their children were also born into slavery. So that's kind of how slavery continued here in the United States. It's a very sad and ugly part of our country. Even though he believed slavery is very evil, and he tried to get rid of it, what's funny is, I guess I shouldn't say funny, what's kind of interesting is that Jefferson himself owned slaves. As almost every wealthy Southern plantation owner owned slaves, and so did he. He had enslaved workers. And he believed slavery was wrong, and he believed everyone to have the same rights, but he didn't really stop the practice of owning his own enslaved workers. And that probably had a lot to do with the views that he would get from people in the South if he had freed his enslaved workers. I don't really know the answer to this, and I don't think he even really had a real good answer for this. So it's just something that I thought you needed to know about Thomas Jefferson, is that he wanted to end slavery. However, he did have his own enslaved workers. This gets us to the lucky bargain. Something very big happened in Thomas Jefferson's presidency. He made a lot of changes right away. First off, he was really angry with some of the laws that John Adams had passed. So right away, he abolished or got rid of some of those laws, him and Congress. But his greatest achievement, one of the biggest things that he's actually remembered for as a president, was actually kind of a surprise. In the 1700s, France at the time had all the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, and that's this right here. All of this land right here, the orange, this belonged to France. And they called it Louisiana after King Louis. France actually ended up giving this land to Spain after it had some wars with Great Britain. So this became part of Spain. And a very important port or area where ships would take goods in the ocean and take it to other places was a place called New Orleans. I'm going to pause for a second. So this very important port was called New Orleans. And it was at this time now owned by Spain because it is right down here at the very foot here. It's in the Gulf of Mexico. Why this was an important port is because the farmers of the United States would send their crops down rivers, which this hole right here, this is the Mississippi River that comes down here. They would send their goods down these rivers and it would end up in New Orleans. They would sell their goods to merchants, and those merchants would take those goods either on ships, they would put them on ships and sail them over to Europe or even into these the colonies or the states up through here. So it was extremely important for the farmers of America. But then Spain suddenly announced that they may no longer allow the farmers of the states to use that port. And farmers started to get angry and they started to get scared for their futures. And then America found out that Spain actually returned that land to France, and that was bad news for the states. Because the French emperor at the time, his name was Napoleon, and he was trying to build a new empire in America, and that could mean war. And if he had that land, he could come over, bring his troops, and there could have been war. And Jefferson knew this, and he wanted to get ahead of this issue. So what he decided to do is he sent representatives to France, and he offered Napoleon $10 million for the city of New Orleans. He wanted to buy the city of New Orleans. He wasn't really too worried about anything, the other, that territory. He just really wanted the port at the time. In fact, I don't think it even occurred to him about that whole territory. But so because he knew the farmers needed that port city of New Orleans. So he offered him $10 million, which seems like a lot of money, but when it comes to purchasing things, that's really purchasing land. This is really not that much. At the same time, France and Britain were fighting again. So Napoleon was at war with Great Britain, and they needed money. And so he actually gave a counter offer to the Americans. He said, no, I'm not going to take your deal. On $10 million for New Orleans. I'm not interested in that. But if you want to buy the entire Louisiana territory and New Orleans, you have to pay me $15 million. So it was $5 million more than the original offer, but they were going to get the entire Louisiana territory after that. And the Americans accepted this right away, and this is now called the Louisiana Purchase. And it doubled the size of America. And they didn't really understand at the time what they had bought because they hadn't sent explorers yet. But as you know, from our Utah unit, explorers eventually ended up traveling west, and that's when they really recognized the deal that they really got. It was a true bargain. $15 million for that amount of land, even in that time, was just pennies per square foot. Or per square acre. It was a huge bargain. But because of this Louisiana Purchase, it's why we have states like Louisiana, Illinois, Nebraska, parts of Wyoming, Colorado, just to name a few. All of these were parts of the Louisiana Territory, and they're now part of the United States, and they're states of the America. So go Jefferson. But he did have some struggles as a president. Again, it came back to staying neutral and staying out of war because France and Britain were fighting again. It seems like they're always fighting. And the U.S. had started to become very important in world trade, meaning that France and Britain both really wanted to buy goods from America. But both sides didn't want the states to sell to their enemies. So Britain didn't want the states to sell to France, and France didn't want the United States to sell to Britain, and that was making those countries mad. And French started to seize American ships again. Remember, this had happened before under Washington and John Adams. Britain did the same thing, but they did something a little bit harsher. They did what's called impressment, and they would seize American ships, and then they would go on and they would take American sailors and force them into the British Navy against their will, like a prisoner. You can kind of see up here, they're taking some American sailors and they're going to be putting them on their ships, kind of like kidnapping. So Americans began getting really angry at these countries. Jefferson did not want to go to war. He knew it was a bad idea. And so he had this idea. He wanted to stop trading with those countries altogether. Kind of like, okay, if you guys can't get along and you're going to keep punishing us for just wanting to stay neutral, we're just going to stop trading to you both. So what he did is he didn't allow any ships, American or any other country, from leaving any port in the United States. The ports up in New England, the New Orleans port, any port where the ships were docked and they were going to be sending goods across the ocean, they could not leave. But he also wasn't going to be letting any other ships in either. So this is called an embargo. He thought that by doing this, Great Britain and France would both want American trade so badly that they would agree to stop seizing their ships. And Congress really agreed. They thought, what a great idea. But it actually ended up being really bad for the American people. Merchants who depended on the selling of goods from farmers to put onto ships lost their businesses. Americans hated the embargo. Farmers even couldn't sell their crops, and shipbuilders lost their businesses too. It was a really, really bad thing for the American people. And so Americans hated the embargo. So worse, though, was that Great Britain and France didn't really even promise to change. It wasn't really affecting Great Britain and France. So 1 year later, Congress ended up canceling the embargo, but French and British went right back to seizing American ships, and the British took American sailors again. So nothing really ever got solved. So that was kind of one of the bad things that happened under Jefferson's presidency. But the important things you need to remember about Thomas Jefferson is first that he believed that all men were equal, even the common man, someone who wasn't born to wealthy, educated people. And he made the Louisiana Purchase, which ended up doubling the size of the United States. So that brings us to our next president, James Madison. So he would be our fourth president. And we're going to talk a bit about his part in the War of 1812. I know you guys know about the Revolutionary War, but did you know there was another war in the United States called the War of 1812? Well, by the time the embargo had ended, there was a new president in the House, and his name was James Madison. So a little bit about James Madison is he's actually known as the father of the Constitution because of what he did to help write it. He did a lot to help write the Constitution. And he had served in Congress and was actually Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. So he was a very well-known politician. And he wasn't any more successful in dealing with France and Britain. He still couldn't get them to stop seizing their ships and taking American sailors. And Americans were really mad at France, but they were even more mad at Great Britain for a lot of reasons. First, not only were they taking American sailors, but also in the Northwest, Native Americans were attacking settlers. Well, why does that matter? The Native Americans, what did they have to do with Great Britain? Well, Great Britain was actually supplying those Native Americans with weapons to do this. They were doing that through their Canadian territory. So Congress decided eventually to declare war on Great Britain in the year of 1812, and that's when James Madison is president. America was not prepared for this war, though. Usually you have time to train your armies and your troops. Remember, America is still a very young nation, and our army and our navy is still very, very small. And so we were not prepared at all. The Navy and the Army was teeny still compared to Great Britain. Great Britain had had hundreds of years to build theirs. America had not many years at all. And so at first, it's no surprise that things didn't go very well for America at first. They were kind of losing a lot of things. But America did get their very first victory, and it was very surprising because it happened on water. And it was on Lake Erie, and that's in the Great Lakes of the United States. You know, those big giant lakes. They did have ships on those lakes at this time that were they would go up these rivers and get so they could bring trade into some of those western colonies or western states and up into Canada. Well, Lake Erie is where this battle happened. And it was a big deal because England's navy was the biggest and the strongest in the world, and teeny tiny little America was able to beat them on the water. It was really a very big deal. And so here's some reasons why they went to war. The British Navy was seizing American trade ships. These are things to remember. So the British Navy was seizing trade ships, and the British Navy were taking American sailors and making them serve in the British Navy. And they were also supplying Native Americans with weapons to attack. So those are important key points to remember why America chose to go to war. And a year later, in 1814, things began getting a little bit worse after that battle on water. The British Navy sailed into a bay outside of Maryland, and it was close to Washington, D.C., where the capital and the president is. And they had troops on their ships ready to destroy the capital city of the United States. And the people of Washington, D.C. ran away to the countryside for safety. And when the troops came in, they went into the White House, destroyed it, and set it on fire, along with other government buildings. They set these places on fire. Luckily enough, though, a hurricane actually came through and caused more damage, but it also helped put the fires out. So that was a bad thing. The troops had come in, they're finally in America, they're burning things up, and they're making their statement. So that gets us to the Battle of New Orleans. So in 1814, the British tried to capture the city of New Orleans because it was a very important city for American trade. And General Andrew Jackson, for America, he was an American general. He had 5,000 militia and men from the frontier. So they weren't really army, but they were just kind of common men. They were waiting for the British to attack. They knew they were coming to New Orleans, and so they were standing there waiting. And there was even, this is kind of interesting, even pirates had joined the Americans to help fight the British. There were pirates at this time that came and helped America. Andrew Jackson and his very unusual army won this battle. They were able to protect New Orleans, and this ended up being the final battle of 1812. But the thing is America really didn't win that many battles, and neither did Britain. Neither side lost, but neither side won either. It was kind of nothing really changed. They both ended with the same land and the same power that they had before. British did stop seizing their ships, though. And the Americans felt stronger after this war because they felt like their brand new nation was able to go up against a big power like Great Britain. So now I want you to complete your exit ticket, please. That is going to be in your Google Classroom, and you're going to go back to your classwork. Go into the next assignment that is listed with this. It's called Expanding a Nation, and please complete that exit ticket. Have a wonderful day.